It's February 1593. A large Chinese army has joined with the Koreans to retake Pyongyang, forcing the Japanese to fall back to Seoul. The tide of Hideyoshi's invasion has now fully turned. Next, it's time for Seoul, the Korean capital, to be retaken. As we're about to see, this is going to be costly for both sides. As always, before we get going, please subscribe to this channel if you like this kind of content, and smash that like button. Okay, let's roll. Let's start with the lay of the land in late February 1593. Konishi Yukinaga's forces have retreated from Pyongyang to Seoul. Kato Kiyomasa is also abandoning the northeastern province of Hamgyong with the two captive Korean princes, Sunhwa and Imhye. The Japanese Central Command, feeling that the invasion army is overextended, has ordered him to pull back to Seoul. Kato is unhappy about this, but he complies. Central Command has also ordered Kobayakawa Takakage, veteran commander of the 6th Contingent, to abandon Kaesong, 50 kilometers north of Seoul. But Kobayakawa is refusing. Finally, after repeated attempts, he's persuaded to pull back as far as Pyeokjae, a day's march north of the capital. He's been given grudging permission to take on the Chinese army when it shows up. Kobayakawa is convinced that this is the only way forward, that the enemy must be met in the open for a decisive battle. "You have always been under the great Taiko Hideyoshi, who has ever been victorious," he explains to his younger colleagues. "You know nothing of defeat, and consequently nothing of how to turn defeat into victory. But that's an old experience with me." So Kobayakawa waits for the decisive battle, the Tenozan that will turn the war back in their favor. The Koreans, meanwhile, are urging Chinese General Li Rusong to advance south from liberated Pyongyang and take Seoul. They're feeling increasingly frustrated now with their Ming allies, for General Li has allowed the Japanese to escape from Pyongyang without being properly punished, and is now advancing on Seoul with maddening slowness. In fairness to Li, it should be pointed out that advancing with an army of more than 40,000 men and tens of thousands of horses is no easy matter. Food has to be secured, camps have to be prepared, and forage obtained for the horses. Finally, the ponderous Ming army starts moving. The Chinese and Koreans take Kaesong only hours after Kobayakawa evacuates his troops. Then they continue on across the Imjin River and set up camp at Paju, 15 kilometers north of Seoul. General Li Rusong's confidence is now running high. On February 27th, he begins the final advance on Seoul, sending out an advance force of 3,000. It runs into a massive Japanese army at Pyeokjae. Kobayakawa's men, plus reinforcements under Ukita Hideye, and is severely beaten. General Li, now alerted, rushes forward. For 2 hours, from 10 o'clock until noon, 20,000 Chinese fight 41,000 Japanese at Pyeokjae, a churning mass of 61,000 combatants. This is Kobayakawa's decisive battle. Japanese muskets and Ming cavalry are useless at such close quarters. It comes down to hand-to-hand fighting, mainly with swords. And the Japanese prevail. Li Rusong's army begins to falter, then turns and runs, the Japanese resorting again to their muskets to pick them off on the road back to Paju. By the end of the day, the Japanese have cut off 6,000 Ming heads. The Battle of Pyeongtaek was a decisive victory for the Japanese. But it didn't turn the tide back in Japan's favor as Kobayakawa had planned. Their situation in Seoul remains desperate. With Kato Kiyomasa's arrival in the capital on March 1st, the number of Japanese in the city rises to 53,000. This is a vast number of mouths to feed, and supplies are running out. At a meeting of all the daimyo, it's decided to draw up a joint letter to Hideyoshi informing him that they will not be able to hold out past the middle of May. Even Kobayakawa signs it. The prospect of starvation leaves him no choice. Days pass, then weeks, and the Chinese army doesn't show up and lays siege to the city. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, General Li Rusong had been badly shaken by his defeat at Pyeongtaek. He has retreated all the way back to Pyongyang, making one excuse after another why Seoul can't be retaken, not yet. March passes, then April, and the Koreans become increasingly dismayed. Finally, it becomes clear that General Li has no intention of attacking Seoul. He's not going to drive the Japanese from the city. His plan, as at Pyongyang, is to negotiate with them to leave. While they're waiting for the Chinese to make the next move, the Japanese in Seoul make a show of strength. On March 14th, 1593, at dawn, a vast Japanese army marches out of the city to wipe out a stronghold of Korean resistance at nearby Hangju. 2,300 Korean fighters are holed up here atop a low hill. Government troops and monk soldiers under civil servant termed Army Commander Kwon Yul. They're joined by terrified civilians, driven inside the fortifications by the 30,000 Japanese troops coming their way. What followed remains for the Korean people one of the most solemn and stirring stories of the entire Imjin War. The defenders of Hangju, outnumbered 10-1, beat off wave after wave of Japanese attackers, whose muskets, thankfully, were of little use charging uphill. The Koreans fight back with arrows and cannons and rocks, with a box-shaped device called a hwacha that fires a fuselage of gunpowder-propelled arrows, with a mechanical spinning wheel contraption called a sucha sokpo that hurls a fusillade of stones that the women defenders have gathered. Finally, at sunset, the Japanese call off the attack. They have just suffered their worst defeat on land at the hands of the Koreans. They gather up their dead and burn them in great piles on the banks of the Han River, a Japanese officer likening the scene to, quote, the river of hell. After they're gone, the Korean survivors come out and set upon the bodies that the Japanese haven't recovered. They cut them into pieces and hang them on the walls of their fort. On May 9th, 1593, a Chinese negotiator named Shen Weijing arrives at Seoul with an ultimatum. Release the 2 Korean princes and leave the city or face total destruction. The timing for the Japanese could not have been better. They have just received orders from Hideyoshi to evacuate Seoul and fall back to Busan. But of course they don't reveal this. Instead, Kunishi Yukinaga informs Shen Weijing that they will only talk with a Chinese envoy with authority to speak on behalf of the Ming Emperor himself. Shen returns a few days later with the requested envoy. 2, in fact. They're actually just 2 of Li Rusong's staff officers, dressed up in court robes. The whole thing is a ruse to get the Japanese out of Seoul without fighting. In the talks that follow, the Japanese agree to withdraw to the south and then release the Korean princes. The two Ming envoys, in turn, agree to accompany Konishi to Japan to negotiate a lasting peace, adding that the Ming emperor might be willing to recognize Hideyoshi as the king of Japan and accept him as a vassal. Konishi knows this won't satisfy Hideyoshi, but he doesn't say anything. He just nods. To smooth things along, Shen Weijing suggests that it could also be arranged as a concession for the Japanese to keep a portion of southern Korea, and for the Koreans to be pressed into sending Hideyoshi tribute. The Koreans, of course, know nothing of this. They've been completely pushed aside. The evacuation of Seoul begins on May 19th, 1593. The south-facing gates are opened and the Japanese file out, accompanied by dragooned local Korean women and musicians playing tunes. The Japanese are putting a good face on their retreat, making it look like a victory. The Koreans and their Chinese allies enter the city the following day. They find Seoul reduced to a wasteland. "I saw that scarcely 100 civilians still remained," wrote Korean Prime Minister Yoo Sung-young. "Those few to be seen were all starving. They were gaunt, sick, and exhausted, the color of their faces like that of a ghost. The weather at this time was extremely hot and humid, so the dead bodies and horse carcasses that lay exposed and unattended throughout the city had begun to rot, emitting such a stench that passers-by had to plug their noses." The Japanese arrived back on Korea's south coast in the middle of June. Their supplies are now totally gone. Reduced to living off the land, they're forced to spread out around Pusan in a string of 17 forts, stretching from Sosangpo to the east, where Kato Kiyomasa made his camp, to Konishi Yukinaga's base at Ungcheon in the west. The Imjin War is settling into a standoff that will last for 4 years.